Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me this morning. I'm really excited to spend the hour with you. We are here for AAC Ready, Set, Goal, and this is part 1 for goal writing considerations for people who use AAC. And tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, we'll be here for part 2. So I hope you can join us for that as well. I'm going to pop my webcam off so you can focus on the slides as we get started here. And again, you'll want to download the handout packet in your materials section. You'll notice that you don't have a copy of the PowerPoint slides, but instead we've given you a very comprehensive packet of resources with the hope that you'll be able to use this to create meaningful goals today and in the future that will be as individualized as your clients are. Note that the icon in the top right-hand corner of these slides will be used throughout the training to help you keep you organized between the handout packet and the PowerPoint presentation. So you can reference that. Okay, a bit of disclosures here. So while we will be discussing goal writing for AAC in general, the products, the apps, and the communication boards featured today are exclusively from Saltillo. I am also a PRC Saltillo employee owner, and my non-financial disclosures are that I'm a WISLA member here in Washington and an ASHA member and an ASHA SIG 12 member. And I often get questions like, do you know of a good AAC goal bank? Or we've tackled this skill, but what should we target next? Or what does a good AAC goal look like? So we wanted to give people resources, ideas, and a place to start. We really want to provide a framework for thinking about goals, a way to think through how to craft a meaningful goal for someone who uses AAC. And as most of you know, and probably why you're here today, creating goals and objectives for someone with AAC can be really challenging. And these are just a couple of the reasons why. Perhaps we don't know enough about AAC, or that language learning is different for people who use AAC. There's lots of things to work on. We know that changes in progress can be subtle and hard to measure. And we also need to consider the environment and our communication partners. So this brings us to our second poll here. What is your greatest challenge with writing goals for people who use AAC? All right. Carryover and use buy-in outside of therapy. What a great point. Yep, that can be a huge barrier. It looks like a lot of people said that changes in progress are really hard to measure. Heather, we just want to know more. Exactly. Yep, there's a lot of, the bottom line here is there's a lot of factors involved, and that can kind of add to the challenge of writing goals for people who use AAC. Exactly. So that is exactly what led us to create this training. And here are the topics we're going to unpack for today. For part 1, we are going to go through understanding the AAC goal framework. I'll introduce a case study that we have sample goals and objectives for, and that this framework is heavily based on the communicative competencies. So today we'll be reviewing linguistic and operational competence. And then tomorrow, we'll review social and strategic competence, as well as making goals smart and monitoring progress. So I hope you can join us for part 2 tomorrow. Jane Corsten is an SLP who created Every Move Counts, which is a program for building communication in individuals with significant sensory motor difficulties. And in her workshop, she asked the question, why do we write goals for people to do something they cannot do to get something they do not want? And this resonates with some of the situations I've encountered working as a clinician and now working in a coaching role with teams who are writing goals for people who use AAC. We really want to make sure we're writing goals that facilitate communication and not a compliance routine. And we want success, and in order to do that, we need to build lots of positive associations with communication and language. And we can build success by having a baseline and knowing what it is that the person cares to communicate about. So just like the slide says up there, we want to focus on the interests and the abilities of our clients and of our students. So we have this GPS analogy to help us understand the goal framework. To obtain directions on our GPS, we need not only the destination, which would be the goal in this case, but we also need to know where we're starting from. And this is the solid baseline. And that's how we can know how to get there. I think many times we think that the goal is the final destination, but we need to consider, are there other benchmarks that show progress towards the destination along the way? Think about the directions that get you to that final destination as your treatment plan. We might use different terminology here. So there are goals, there are objectives, benchmarks. Today, we don't want to get lost in the details and the technicalities of these different terms, but we do want to help you figure out how to determine and reach your desired result. So we're going to use all of these words here. They all mean the same thing. I like this quote from Jane Corsten. The underlying intention of the goal is to identify what is expected to change as a result of intervention. So we're going to keep this in mind as we develop goals today for our case studies. Reviewing AAC and goal writing literature, and then pulling from personal experience as SLPs and consultants, we selected 3 important frameworks to use to create an AAC goal worksheet. And these include communicative competencies, goal attainment scaling, and SMART terminology. So this is the AAC goal framework. It's on page 4 of your handout. And each of those 3 elements that were in the funnel are incorporated here into the development of this form. So let's spend some time briefly discussing what each of those are and how you could use them. So we'll start at the top with the 4 communicative competencies. Communicative competence is defined as the ability to communicate functionally in natural environments and to meet daily communication needs. And these can be divided into 4 interrelated domains areas. There's linguistic, operational, social, and strategic competency. And we'll go through each of these in more depth as we progress during the training today and tomorrow. But just as an overview, linguistic competency is the ability to use and understand language. Operational competency refers to the technical skills to use an AAC system. Social competency is the ability to use and understand rules of interaction. And then finally, strategic competency relates to the use of compensatory strategies to overcome obstacles and prevent and repair communication breakdowns. So if you have sufficient language skills, you know how to use the AAC system, you have strategies to use when things don't work, and you understand the rules of interaction, then you are on your way to becoming a competent and successful communicator. And therefore, when you write these goals, it's important for us to consider each of these areas for the person using AAC. Identify areas of weakness and skills that need to be taught to make your client a more competent communicator. The next part is the inclusion of the goal attainment scale. This is the tool to help us define and organize our path. So it was originally developed by Kearse and Sherman as a way to measure behavioral change in the mental health field, but it has since grown in popularity in other fields like geriatrics, early intervention, occupational therapy, and then more recently in speech language therapy as it relates to people who use AAC. It's basically a way to measure progress toward behavioral goals and objectives where traditional outcome criteria like trials or percentages don't clearly capture progress. And it also helps to measure and compare progress across goals. So basically for level 1, you have our baseline. We want to think about stimulability and where do they have some emerging skills that can make the goal we're about to write obtainable. Level 3 is our expected destination, given the timeline and setting that you're working in. So perhaps it's an IEP year, Or if it's in a private clinic, it could be 10 approved insurance visits, or it could be 1 month of rehab. And then level 5 is our long-term hope for the goal. And note that that does not necessarily equate to 100% accuracy. It's usually going to be the level 3 goal in a more generalized context. So we're thinking about where are we today and where do we want to be in the future and how do we get there? I think this quote fits nicely from our rationale for using the goal attainment scale, that expectations will be more attainable and less frustrating when the individual is viewed based on true ability rather than unrealistic expectations. Acknowledging and being guided by an individual's interests and abilities is crucial when developing a communication system. And that's from Corsten from Every Move Counts. So the final element of the goal framework is this SMART terminology. And this is purposely positioned at the bottom of that form as the initial focus is on getting the content of the goals down. And then the SMART framework helps us to fine-tune our writing and ensure that we have included all the necessary components to be considered quality goals and objectives. So in this context, the goal attainment scale, it's not unique to AAC, and the individual letters often take on different meanings depending on the context, the field that people are using this SMART framework within. So to review, for the purpose of our use today, this is what they stand for. The S is specific or clear, such that somebody else could easily understand the goal. It's measurable, so we can show progress and we know when we've achieved the desired outcome. It's agreed upon, so we're sure to support the desires of the whole team, especially that of the person who uses AAC and their family. It's realistic and relevant. Realistic given the knowledge, the time and age, and availability of resources, or it could be considered relevant for the person today and tomorrow. And it's also time-based so that we know how much time we have to work towards our goal. So this is that SMART framework. I'm going to introduce you to our case study, which we'll use today to practice writing and brainstorming goals and objectives using that form. So let's meet Matthew. He is a 6-year-old boy with autism. His fine motor, vision, and hearing skills are within normal limits, but he doesn't like loud noises. He got a NovaChat 8 2 months ago, and he's using a vocabulary file called WordPower 60 Basic. And he uses some signs and words on his communication device, some signs and then some words on his communication device to communicate. Okay, this is a really important point to consider and understand. We need to know what motivates him. What does he like to do? What might he want to control or communicate about? We also might want to know the people he likes to communicate most with. And so we'll be keeping those in mind as we write his goals. What we'll do now is first talk about how and why we select targets for each competency. Second, we'll talk about how to use the AAC goal framework to complete the chart. And then third, we'll finish it up with a SMART check. So let's start with linguistic competency. Notice the Venn diagram here. As we go along, we'll discuss how these communicative competencies can overlap with each other. So what is linguistic competence? It's our ability to use language expressively and to understand the meaning of language receptively. It involves a spectrum of skills starting with basic functional communication all the way up to complex reading and writing skills. To be linguistically competent looks different for different people. If you're an SLP, then you already have a good understanding of what it means to have receptive and expressive language skills that are developmentally on track. Basically, linguistic competence refers to how well we understand and use language. So I'm going to walk through the rationale for how we chose these 2 linguistic objectives for Matthew. And next we'll go through some ways to measure this linguistic competence to obtain a baseline and measure progress. And then we'll plug these into the goal attainment scale so you can get an idea of how to use this AAC goal framework. The two objectives are increasing use of prepositions and increasing ability to state likes and dislikes. What is your go-to tools for determining language goals? Give me 1 second here. There we go. Is it, there's really no wrong answer here. Do you use formal standardized tests, developmental milestones or checklists, language samples, or is it something else? And if it's something else, feel free to type it into the chat window. Okay, we'll close this. It looks like a lot of people, it's basically a mix. Here, let's see. Share so you can see it. So we've got a mix of formal standardized tests. Sometimes that's appropriate. Language samples, developmental milestones, and then some other ideas that people threw out in the chat. That's great. So one of the best resources you can use to determine target areas to work on is typical language development. And there are a lot of great available tools and charts you can use to help make sense of language development, such as the functions of communication, core vocabulary, and Brown's stages of development and grammar. So let's take a look at these. Brown's stages of development and grammar have been used to develop many other frameworks. It includes pragmatic, semantic, morphology, and syntactic expectations based on developmental language stages, ranging from single word productions and then progressing to more multi-word utterances. If we think back to our days in school, we might remember learning these, seeing this chart in grad school. There are a few tools that use the Brown stages in a more user-friendly format that I've listed here. So there's a free version of Brown's from Linguisystems called Guide to Communication Milestones. And this includes the Brown stages and other charts of early language acquisition. It's really user-friendly. And there's a link to these resources. I believe it's page 6 of your handout. And then the other tool I wanted to share was designed specifically for the field of AAC. It's called the Quad Communication Profile. The aim of this profile was to provide a tool that enables a clinician to perform a simple, quick evaluation of language performance of someone who uses a speech generating device. So it's basically a set of 4 checklists that focus on vocabulary, the words an individual uses to build sentences, morphology, the way words change within a sentence, syntax, the order of words within a sentence, and then function, what the purpose of a sentence is or why we communicate. And the link for the free Quad profile is also in your handout. I believe that's also page 6. When using these developmental frameworks, it's important to keep in mind that language acquisition theories were really developed to account for language learning under typical circumstances. And language learning for people who use AAC is usually different. To name a few reasons why, there's often reduced opportunities overall to express themselves. Difficulty with initiation and controlling interactions, and then generally someone else has control over the vocabulary supplied in a device. And this can be, unfortunately, less robust than they might need. So here's another tool, the Functions of Communication by Janice Light. The functions of communication are the reasons or the why behind why we communicate. Janice Light proposed 4 general categories of communicative functions: communicating wants and needs, exchanging information, developing social closeness, and fulfilling social etiquette. Can you guess? I'm curious, you can type it right into the chat window. Do you have a guess about which function makes up the majority of the reason why most people communicate? You had to put a guess on one of those. Wants and needs. Yeah, that's a good guess. We would think early on, wants and needs can be more of a priority, but as as our needs grow and change, social closeness is actually the reason that most of us, the why behind why we communicate. We crave social closeness, and so that drives most of why we communicate, especially as we get older and age into adulthood. So in our AAC implementation toolkit training, we dive deeper into that research and the functions of communication. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to check out that training. And then for early communicators, even early communicators, this can be a really nice place to start. So you can write goals that will show an increase in the number of communicative functions expressed and used appropriately by the child. So we can look at these functions of communication and write goals addressing these. This, again, it's part of the AAC implementation toolkit training. It's a little sneak peek. We offer lists that different functions of communication in more detail. And this is also in your handout packet, and it can serve as a place to start thinking about these different functions. That first column is communicating wants and needs, and it goes beyond requesting food or drinks or toys. It includes things like requesting attention, requesting activities, directing action, things like that. And then the next main area is exchanging information. So it includes things like asking and answering questions, labeling, sharing objects and events, giving opinions, stating personal information. And then that last main area is social closeness and etiquette. And social closeness means those things that you typically do with someone who's close to you, like our family and our friends. This would be things like expressing feelings, commenting, taking turns, and gossiping. Social etiquette are those things that we do according to social norms, things like greetings or closings and saying please and thank you. So just some ideas there. There are other tools that look at functions of communication differently. So here's one example from the Quad profile that divides language functions based on 7 types of functions. The other thing we wanted to draw attention to as a way to measure linguistic competence is core vocabulary. And as you know, core vocabulary are those words that make up the majority of what we say. So we have 250 to 400 words that make up about 80% of everything that we say. And what we know about core vocabulary is that it allows for flexibility and novel generation. We know it's useful across contexts. We know it can be combined to increase semantic syntactic complexity. And it allows for expression of a variety of different communicative functions. It also has consistent location across vocabulary, and it overlaps with academic core vocabulary and literacy. So those are really important. And there are lots of different core vocabulary lists available and resources, but in your handout, you have a collection of early core words. Those are on page 8 and 9, just to have for your reference. So how did we decide on these 2 objectives for Matthew? We took a few of those resources we had available to us, and we thought about his language. When I started thinking about Matthew's core vocabulary, I wasn't really sure which core words he was currently using. So I generated an inventory of all of his language, whether it was signed, a word approximation, or if it was generated on his NovaChat. And this was based on parent and teacher report and observation. And now with this word inventory, I can compare this to the early language word lists. And then we can reflect on what he has and what he doesn't have yet in his language use. So then my next question is, what words might be appropriate to target next based on what I know about Matthew? What would be the most functional and motivating for him to learn to use? So simply highlighting the words on the core lists that Matthew uses allows me to see where some target vocabulary may be. I decided I wanted to teach him how to use some more prepositions because prepositions are words used and understood early in language development. And they're not currently in his repertoire. I also could easily think of some structured play activities that we can incorporate prepositions that would be really fun and motivating for him. We also took an inventory of his functions of communication. And when we think about Matthew, we know that he communicates to request objects. He says things like, I want iPad or I want to eat. He directs preferred actions using the words go and stop. And he labels colors. And he also is able to deny with no. So this is what he can do. Then we have to ask ourselves, what might be appropriate to strengthen or target next? Or asked in another way, what will make the most difference for Matthew? And this is where you realize there are so many things that we can work on. How do I decide what to work on next? His team has expressed concern with how he currently shuts down if he doesn't like something. So starting from that point, we decided to work on stating his opinion and starting at an introductory level like and don't like. So we can start to do more with his language and self-advocate for himself. We already know that he has things that he has strong preferences for and against, like loud noises. So we can use this information when we're addressing this goal. And then once you know what you want to work on, you are ready to brainstorm what that might look like as an objective or a goal and how to get there. So we're going to walk through writing one of these two objectives in your handout. You have a completed form for the linguistic competency on page 11, so don't worry about getting every word down here. This is really more about the process and the thinking through aspect. So the first thing we're going to do is fill in his name and check the competency that we're addressing. So we'll start with linguistic. Our overarching goal is to increase or improve Matthew's linguistic competency. And now we're going to write a goal or objective to increase the use of prepositions. So I provided some examples that I think would be appropriate based on those core word lists that we have. And these also happen to all be on his home page of his WordPower 60 basic vocabulary file. This will allow him for quicker access and hopefully better success to start using those words. Okay, next, using that information that we discussed, we can describe his baseline at level 1. What can Matthew do now as it relates to core vocabulary, or more specifically, with prepositions? And we know that Matthew expresses, either via sign or verbalization or with his speech device, 18 core words, but he doesn't yet use any prepositions. So that's what we're going to put in his baseline. Next, I'm going to write this for Matthew, but if you have a student with whom you're working, I want you to know you are welcome to modify what we're doing here to better fit that student or that client. So we're just walking through this with Matthew, but feel free to be thinking of your own client here. Because in this level 3, based on the baseline info and on Matthew's learning style, we can decide what he can be expected to achieve during that IEP year. That's our level 3. And here we're going to say that Matthew will use 6 target prepositions to direct action during structured play activities with minimal support. And next we're going to write a step that would be in between where he is now at his baseline and where he's expected to go at level 3. So I wrote some hints up there about how we might want to measure change, because these are the types of things that we might want to include in our level 2. Now there is not one right way to do this. The way you write it will highly depend on your experience and where you're working with your client. But does anyone have any ideas for what parameter we might change, how we're going to measure that progress between the jump from level 1 to level 3. There's not really a right answer here because there are so many options that we can choose. Just thinking about how we're going to measure change. What might we change for this level 2? For me, I put, we are going to use 6 target prepositions to direct action during a structured play activity with moderate support. So I changed the level of support. Yeah, but Heather has a great idea. You can change the level of prompting. You can change the number of targets. Exactly. You can change a lot of different aspects of this goal depending on the student that you're working with and what you think is most clinically appropriate for them. We're going to move to level 4. So if Matthew were to meet his goal at level 3, what would we want him to be able to do next? Matthew will use 6 target prepositions during less structured activities now. So here we changed the activity. And then finally, we'll take a moment to think about what would be functional for Matthew long-term for this goal. So you'll notice we're not necessarily filling this out in a linear way from top to bottom or bottom to top. It makes sense to start with the baseline and then determine the expected goal for the time period. But in some cases, after determining the baseline, it might make more sense to write out the best expected level 5 before determining that intermediate goal. So go in the order that flows best with your thought process here. We have that Matthew will use 6 target prepositions spontaneously when appropriate. So this is the skill generalized, our long-term hope for the goal. And now we've completed the first objectives with benchmarks for a functional skill for Matthew as it relates to his linguistic abilities. So if you're feeling like this is a lot, there are areas that you really need to do are really the objective, the baseline, and the level 3. Once you have those, you'll be able to fill in the other 3 levels by adding or changing different parameters like level of support, or the number of opportunities or trials, or the number of communication partners that you're working with. You could also change things like the environment, percentage or frequency, or duration or speed. So there's lots of options here for parameters that you can adjust. So then you'd return to your linguistic goal sheet and do the same process for a second objective. For the sake of time today, we're not going to walk through this second objective, but instead you have a completed version of that form in your handout. So we're just going to highlight a couple of those levels. So I would do the same thing with the second objective. The objective putting in there is to increase the ability to state his likes and dislikes. And then we would go to the level 1 or the baseline, which is that Matthew says no when asked, do you want? And plugs his ears or rocks when experiencing things he doesn't like. And then we'd move to the level 3, which is the expected outcome for the goal. That Matthew will express like to indicate satisfaction for 10 known preferred items or activities when asked his opinion, like a question like, what do you think? So you would continue to think through the other 2 levels, and when we're finished, we'd have a plan to help Matthew start to state his opinion related to his likes and his dislikes of those activities. Okay, some questions here that I want you to be thinking about. How might we translate these into an IEP or other format that you're already using? Because if your place of work already has a process or a template, we really want to incorporate this into what you're already doing so you're not doing double duty for your goal writing. And how do I help Matthew reach these objectives? What will working on these objectives actually look like? Not just for me, but also for the entire team. And especially now during these times of online and virtual learning, being the coach and working through how other members of the team, including parents, are going to be helping to address these goals is more important than ever. So being really clear about what it could look like as we're supporting this client. So first step, we'll talk about translating it into another format. How might I incorporate this brainstorming form into what I'm already doing or what my work, my place of business is already asking me to complete? One option is to attach it and treat it like a rubric so that the goals and the objectives would be included by referencing the rubric. So maybe including this in the IEP and referencing the rubric for your goals. You could also take the information and translate it into whatever format you need to have for your IEP or for your clinic report. So for example, using terms like baseline or present level of performance instead of level 1 on the goal attainment scale. Or using the word goal instead of level 3 on the goal attainment scale for what is expected for that time period. And then you could also use the goal form and attach it, right, as your clinical documentation and reference your form. So for your baseline, you could simply state something like see level 1 on the AAC goal framework attached. So again, trying to minimize the need for double duty on your goals. Okay, this is incredibly important, especially now in our times of virtual learning. What skills does his communication partner need to have in order for him to be successful? So when we write goals, we really need to think not only about the goals and the skills needed by the individual, but also from the people who will be supporting that student in reaching those goals. So for this objective, the first objective, using prepositions, the communication partner has to know a couple of things in order to help Matthew reach those goals. They need to know where those words are in his vocabulary file. Where do they live in his speech device? And if they don't know, they can learn on the NovaChat devices how to use the word finder feature to locate those words. So sometimes just knowing about tools and functions of the communication device to help support the communication partner is really valuable here. And then since the objective includes given aided language input, the communication partner needs to know what that means, what that includes, and how to do it. And then for the second objective, the communication partner needs to know things like where the word like is in his vocabulary. And they need to know things that Matthew likes and doesn't like. So these are kind of skills that the communication partner needs to know to help support Matthew. This is a tool for other communication partners to use. So think about communication partners could be paraprofessionals or teachers or parents, probably primarily parents at this point, to make sure everybody knows what the prompts should look like for cueing and then fading those cues for certain skills. So your team might have something else that helps you to relay the nuances of prompting and fading prompts for certain skills. You certainly don't need to use this idea of a cue card, but it gives a really clear description of what the support will actually look like. So an example, some teams, I've heard of teams that use video clips to show what the therapeutic interaction looks like, or with ABA therapy, some clinicians will write out procedures for each goal. So it's really crystal clear for how to target. So find what works for you, especially depending on if your team is working virtually or if they're in more of a hybrid model. Find a system where the people who are supporting the student know how to prompt and support that student in achieving their goal. So in this specific example, the cue card reads how to set up the activity. And it also lists the question to ask and the prompts, including the wait time. So you might go on to elaborate here by saying, if he doesn't select the correct preposition after gesturing and waiting again, we can point directly to the target preposition. We can wait again. We can gradually increase the intrusiveness of the prompts. You can highlight the preposition icons on the home page. You can write out your procedure for how you're going to support the student. I've found that this can be incredibly helpful for parents, as everyone has so much to juggle now, given all of the virtual learning and doing so many different things at once, and parents having to wear so many different hats. If we're really clear on what we're asking them to do to support the student and the communication device, I find that kind of sets the whole team up for better success and less frustration overall. Okay, let's take a pause here. Does anybody have any questions so far? I want to make sure we have time for questions. I built in a little time here. You can feel free to type them into the chat window if you've kind of been saving any. Otherwise, we will have some time at the end too. Okay, let's keep cruising along. We're going to go to operational competency. So this is on page 13 of your handout packet. So the goal for the person who uses AAC is really to operate their system independently. We want to teach people who use AAC the mechanics of their technology so that they can build independence and self-advocacy skills. And for Matthew, we chose speak the message by using the SMART period and to carry his device himself. So let's take a look at the rationale for choosing these two objectives before we go to the goal framework. Unlike the linguistic skills, there aren't any formal assessments or checklists for what operational skills are required. In your handout, you have one brainstorming tool, and this is what we'll use today. We're going to provide a few examples of skills and then walk you through writing one operational objective for Matthew. Keep in mind, though, this brainstorming tool is not a comprehensive list, and it's not in a hierarchy. These are just some ideas to be considered for you in one spot. Okay, we're going to do our last poll here. Hang tight with me. Do you have any goals written to specifically address operational skills at the moment for your clients? It's absolutely okay if you're not sure. Okay, looks like people responded pretty quickly there. Oh, we've got, here, I'll share it here. Some people aren't sure, but the majority of people are using no. So let's see if we can provide a little bit more clarity for what operational skills would look like and how you might incorporate them. So with the example of charging the device, there are a few ways Matthew or someone could display operational competence. He or she could select the battery status button. That's one example. Matthew could also use a pre-programmed button. There's a My Device page on the NovaChat devices on the social page, and so he could tell someone when his device needs to be charged. Or another way Matthew or someone could exhibit operational competence simply by taking his device to a charging station at the end of the day. So these are just some ideas. Another example could be competence in using a dynamic display. So for example, knowing the home button takes you back to the home screen, or that the lock button would keep you on a current page instead of bouncing back home. So here are some additional examples. We're going to use the SMART period to speak your message. or how to clear using the X in the speech display bar, or using that lock page function. So these are just some examples. In thinking about operational competence, I wanted to also address access for a device quickly. When we talk about access, we're really thinking about how the person uses and makes selections on the device itself. So we know that there's direct selection with our finger, there's head tracking using the chat point on the Chat Fusion. There's also head tracking in the Touch Chat app on the new VIA Pro, and you could use switch scanning. So depending on the access method used, you'll likely have different skills to target here. And increasing speed may be related to how quickly someone can put two words together, something like that. Might also be achieved by decreasing the acceptance time or the dwell time, or using an auditory prompt. These are some examples of operational skills to target in terms of access. So you could target how to wake up or turn on your device, or you could target how to use that kickstand so you can see the vocabulary on the screen, or providing communication partners education for mounting or positioning so that the device can be accurately used. If you're looking for a few resources to help determine possible steps or processes involved in developing skills related to access, both of these resources break down that hierarchy. This is on page 14 in your handout. Just thinking about that, really, if access isn't in place, that becomes the priority. Access needs to be in place, and it trumps the other competencies in terms of skills that need to be targeted. So to figure out what operational skills to target for Matthew, we went through this brainstorming tool and highlighted the things he was doing, made comments about the skill level. We went from there. So we checked that he could adjust the volume button, but noted in the comments that he uses it, but doesn't adjust it appropriately. And I think, oops, I missed a comment here. Using the volume absolutely can be part of these skills. And then based on what Matthew can do, we selected 2 operational skills to target. Using that SMART period to speak the message is something that's completely new to Matthew. But based on the fact that he's using 2 to 3 words together, we want to make sure that he's speaking his message as a whole. So we included that one. And the other objective is to carry the device. This is an emerging skill, but he's highly dependent on prompts to do this. So we want to increase independence and frequency with that goal. So we start with writing Matthew's name and checking operational competency. And don't worry, this is in your handout already, so no need to write every word down here. And then we're going to speak the message in the speech display bar by using the SMART period as our objective. He needs to be able to string the words in his utterances together so that his communication partners can hear his entire message. Then we're going to jump down to the level 1 baseline. What can Matthew do currently? We know he selects 2 to 3 words in a sequence, like play iPad, but he does not speak the entire message. So based on the baseline info and Matthew's learning style, we can decide what he can be expected to achieve during that IEP year. And it's that he's going to use the SMART period to speak his message of 2 or more words with no more than 1 visual prompt. And now we're going to write a step that would be in between those 2 levels. We have that Matthew will use the SMART period to speak his message of 2 or more words with no more than 1 visual and 1 verbal prompt. And then we jump up to level 4. If Matthew were to meet level 3, his goal, what would we want him to do next? He would use the SMART period to speak his message of 2 or more words, just given expectant wait time. So here we're changing the level of support. And then level 5, what's our ultimate long-term goal for Matthew with the SMART period? And we have that he'll use the SMART period to speak his messages of 2 or more words as appropriate. So again, changing that level of support and the number of words there. And there you have it. So if we put back in the other objective about carrying his AAC device, we now have 2 objectives ready to go to support his operational competence. Okay, and then thinking about what skills his communication partners need in order to help him be successful with these. Can't forget about this part. They would need to know how to use the SMART period and how to prompt given the goal that we've created. So what does it mean? What does a gestural prompt and a natural verbal cue look like? And that is where this cue card comes back into play. You can have your written out goals and the procedure for how to help support the communication partners in prompting for Matthew. Quick note about operational skills. These aren't always listed as part of an IEP, but some funding sources will look for them. So that's why I wanted to include them as an option here. Funding sources like Medicaid might look for operational skills. So it's just important to have an idea of what they could look like. I'll mention too, if you are on social media, there's a Nova Chat Fusion users group on Facebook, and there's also the Saltillo brand Facebook. If you're ever interested in some implementation ideas for using with your students or your clients who use AAC, there's wonderful ideas shared on those social media groups. So I would highly recommend checking those out.